Dr. Hernandez. And we're grateful to the Williams family who have over the years continued to provide support for this program and allow us to do this work. So an appreciation for Dr. Williams and for the family for making all of this possible. Dr. Hernandez comes from us tonight now from the Iliff School of Theology, one of our peer schools, one of 13 United Methodist schools located in Denver, Colorado. You also can look on the back of your program and see a little bit about what makes this man's life work. He is, on top of all of this, a scholarly work, a dean, a president, and an all-around seminary steward. I have gotten to know Albert in a number of contexts now, most recently as a colleague in the Association of United Methodist Theological Schools. I could read to you some of the details, but you can see some of his publications. You can see what his scholarly interests are and what his current title is. I would simply share with you the first time I had an opportunity to meet Dr. Hernandez. I was serving on the Board of Trustees at the Iliff School of Theology, and we had heard about a new person coming through a faculty search. I had not had any real engagement with this search, but I had heard good things, and I knew that this person had a very interesting field of study. He was a medieval church historian, focused on the things going on in Andalucía, Spain, in terms of interreligious relations. It all made perfect sense in the abstract. It seemed like a good hire as we heard about him at a meeting on the afternoon of September 10th, 2001. The next day, our school seemed like it must be filled with geniuses to have brought someone into our midst in a time of deep pain for a world, for a nation, and for our community of faith. And when I met Dr. Hernandez, I believe for the first time we were wandering through an Islamic center down on Parker Road, and you helped us begin to learn. And it has been a wonderful experience for the years since to see how you connect the deep understanding you have for your work with the world around you. We're grateful to have you here and to be a part of that work tonight. Help me welcome Dr. Hernandez.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the administration and the faculty of MTSO and the Williams family for this honor and this opportunity. It is both a pleasure and a sincere honor to be able to have been invited here to share with you a subject and a period of great interest to me, and one that I believe still has a lot of lessons to teach us given the current global situation. I want to let you know that my field of medieval religious studies, in particular, those of us who specialize in medieval Iberia, have seen an amazing renaissance of interest in our teaching and our scholarship, and in the post 9/11 period. Unfortunately, crusade studies are also booming. Go figure. In part because the terrorists on 9/11 made it about the Crusades, and in part also because our own government used the word crusade on September the 12th of 2001. You may recall an allusion to a crusade to rid the world of this evil that befell us the day before. So imagine as a relatively young and still young at that time, and a freshly minted PhD, I had occasion in, I believe it was 2004, I was at the Medieval Academy of America annual meeting in Seattle in April of that year, and there was a panel on how to teach the medieval Mediterranean in a post 9/11 world. Now, the medieval Mediterranean is code language for the period of Andalucía, of medieval Spain, and of the encounter among Christians, Jews, and Muslims along the Mediterranean basin. And I will never forget, I knew something was up when the panel was comprised primarily of Crusade historians and not necessarily of people from my subfield of medieval Iberia. And I will never forget the question that was asked of one of the panelists, a distinguished colleague of mine from East Coast University. And he was simply asked, a very simple question. After all, this is what the panel was all about. How do you deal with the specter of 9/11 in your classes? How do you handle it? And his response, I think, changed my career and changed my outlook. He responded, "I do not allow current events to contaminate my classroom." See, I'm on good ground here because some of you reacted the same way the audience did that day. So in a room with about 300 to 400 medievalists, you just heard this collective displeasure from the audience. And I thought that was a good thing. But I also remember telling my distinguished colleagues that I was now teaching at a school of theology, a seminary associated with the United Methodist Church, and that my students would never have allowed me the luxury of claiming that kind of detached, logical, positivist, scientific, empirical excess, because my students at Iliff were always interested in the practical implications of many of the subjects that I was sharing with them in the classroom. So that really changed me and made me realize, granted, that was already 3 years after 9/11, and I had sort of already crisscrossed the country doing lectures and presentations very much like the one I'm sharing with you this evening and the one that I will share with you tomorrow morning. I don't pretend that the rediscovery or the reinterpretation or the study of medieval Spain and its legacies of religious coexistence are going to solve the world's current problems. However, I am willing to wager that an awareness of the cultural and theological and socio-political dynamics that made that incredible civilization possible may teach us a thing or two to us in the early 21st century as we continue to navigate and negotiate the historic divide, the historic tensions that have existed between Islam and Christianity. Tensions that go all the way back to the medieval period, and tensions that we can call upon and conjure at a moment's notice by just using certain words inappropriately or carelessly, such as the word crusading. A few years ago, someone did some research, and I don't know whether it's true or false. I just recall coming across an entry in a newspaper that George Bush was a descendant of Richard the Lionheart. Okay? I don't care. But I was kind of intrigued and puzzled by the way people reacted to that. In the United States, most people were like, big deal, who cares? In some parts of the Arab world and of the Islamic world, most of the world's Muslims actually do not live in the part of the world that we call the Middle East. They live outside of that region. But I was really puzzled by the way that some publications and media in the Arab and Islamic world picked that up and said, see, this is proof that it runs in his blood. Think about that. And pause for a moment and realize what an incredibly mobile society we are. Many of us will not live out our lives in the area that we were born in. We will move to and from. Our children will move. Our grandchildren will move. But if you go to some parts of Europe and to many parts of the Middle East and regions beyond, you will find people who can actually claim an identity to a place or to a village that spans centuries. 700 years in some cases. And families will bring out a sword that has been passed down from one generation to another, literally going back to the time of the Crusades. That kind of connection to place and memory, and to memories attached to incidents and movements and wounds, if you will, is kind of baffling in some ways to our American perceptions. Again, given how mobile we are and how different we are as a society. Let me share a poem with you, because it is very much a part of the theme that I am sharing with you this evening. The theme is that of tragedy, but tragedy based upon lost memory, and tragedy based upon missed opportunities. The poem is actually, this is just a short excerpt from one of the longest, probably the longest poem ever written in the history of the world, 187,000 lines long. It was written by a Muslim scholar who spent the first half of his life in Spain and spent the next half of his life traveling around the Middle East after he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca. His name is Ibn al-Arabi. The poem is called the Meccan Revelations, or in Arabic it would be the Futuhat al-Makkiyya. Futuh means literally opening. So it is a reference to the opening of the human heart in relationship to God through the Holy Scriptures, and in this case, the Holy Quran. So even though most Western scholars translate it as Meccan Revelations, probably a much better title for the Futuhat al-Makkiyya would be Meccan Openings. One of my colleagues in the SUNY system, State University of New York system, has been translating the Futuhat al-Makkiyya for over 30 years, and he hopes that younger scholars, he doesn't mean me, I'm not an Arabist, but he hopes that a new generation of scholars will pick up the translation project and finish it for him, because he says that in order for him, this is William Kiddick, by the way, for him to fully translate the Futuhat al-Makkiyya, he would need 3 careers of about 35 years each. And this is just a tiny excerpt. So Ibn Arabi was born in Andalucía around 1165 and died in 1240. He is, along with Rumi, one of the 2 greatest Sufi mystics of Islamic history. Ibn Arabi writes, "My heart is open to all forms. It is a pasture for gazelles and a monastery for Christian monks, a temple for idols and the Kaaba of the pilgrim, the tables of the Torah and the book of the Holy Quran. Mine is the religion of love. Wherever his caravans turn," his is capitalized, meaning God, "wherever his caravans turn, the religion of love shall be my religion and my faith." This is written at the height of the Crusades. And I will share with you tonight a few other examples of the incredible creativity and interreligious cooperation that occurred in medieval Spain for centuries and centuries, even as Europe all around it and the Mediterranean to the south was embroiled in significant violence and conflict over territory, and often masquerading as conflicts over religion. Because those conflicts were not always about religion. We would prefer to think it that way, but sometimes that's really not what was going on. So Ibn Arabi is just one example among several that I'm going to share with you this evening. And let me turn the clock back to October of 2001. The invasion of Afghanistan and of Iraq were underway, and I was at a faculty dinner of some sort. I don't recall what the exact venue was. It was attended by Iliff faculty and faculty from the University of Denver, and a colleague of mine from the University of Denver says to me, "Hey, Albert, did you hear bin Laden is talking about Andalucía? I was like, what? Bin Laden is talking about Andalucía? What do you mean? So, I went home, I Googled it, and sure enough, bin Laden and some of his top lieutenants were making statements to the effect that they were sincerely hoping that the tragedy of Andalucía would not be repeated again in our time. And I was like, wow. Talk about misusing history. And so for the last 11 years, 12 years now, I have been using that theme of the tragedy of Andalucía in a very different way than I think what bin Laden was trying to do that month. But bear in mind that the mere fact that Osama bin Laden referred to the lost legacy of this time period, and that I teach about the lost legacies and lessons of this time period, also show us that history is alive and teeming with possibility, but that history can also be a mirror onto which we project all sorts of things that maybe we shouldn't be projecting. You see? Because sometimes that is the magic of believing these historical narratives. You sometimes, if you're not careful, if you don't have the proper academic perspective or a discerning mind, you could end up simply seeing in the historical record what you are seeking for all sorts of selfish and inappropriate reasons. Nonetheless, let us move on. So, Al-Andalus was the Arabic term for the region. Today, that would be the region in and around the city of Madrid, stretching out, several dozen miles or several hundred miles, depending on who you talk to. Andalucía is what the Spaniards would later call it. And to make a long story short, in the year 711, a group of Berber tribesmen crossed over from Morocco into Europe around the point of the Strait of Gibraltar and changed European history in what I consider to be a very dramatic way that would have profound implications for the future of Europe, even though today most American school children hardly ever hear a word about that legacy. The people who were on the receiving end of that incursion, or invasion if you will, believe it or not, saw the newcomers in some ways as liberators, because the region had been governed by the Visigoths since the fall of the Roman Empire, and they had not been very nice stewards of their subjects, of their people. In fact, they had been rather abusive, rather unfair, especially to the local Jewish community in southern Spain. Armed with the teachings of Muhammad, which placed a very special value on the role of the Jewish community to the Islamic community, the Jews are part of the Al-Kitab, literally the people of the book, as Muhammad put it. And who are the people of the book? Well, the children of Abraham. The Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims together. And so there were already practices and legal traditions going back almost 100 years, respecting the integrity of the Jewish community and the integrity of the Christian community as well. Add to that the Islamic emphasis on literacy and on the empowerment of women to, for example, read and write, being taught full literacy. You can see why those Moroccan invaders or Berber tribesmen were welcomed with a sense of relief by some of the people there in southern Spain. That period, however, lasts a relatively short time, because it is in 756, May 14th to be exact, of 756, that what we have described as the golden age of medieval Spain and the Islamic civilization of medieval Spain really takes on a new life. It was May 14th of 756 when an Umayyad prince who had survived the massacre of his family several thousand miles away, way back in the heart of the Middle East, made his way through the countryside, across the deserts. His mother had been a Berber princess, and he figured that he would have safety and protection among his mother's people. But he had heard about this land across the Mediterranean, this land across the Strait of Gibraltar, this land called Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula. And bear in mind, he was a prince who represented, in his estimation, he represented all that Muhammad wanted for the future of the Islamic community. And so that May of 756, he crossed over into Spain and began informing the people that he was the rightful caliph, the heir to a legacy that Muhammad had set in place. Caliph means successor to the Prophet. To make a long story short, within a few short months he had overthrown the earlier Berber and Moroccan leaders and sets up a dynasty that would lead to the first golden age of the medieval period in Spanish history. He set up his capital city in Córdoba, and the Cordovan state for the next several hundred years is, in the words of Maria Rosa Menocal, the ornament of the world, or the envy of the world, if you will. Abd al-Rahman the First truly believed that a multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious society would thrive if he could ensure prosperity and if he could ensure education as widely distributed as possible. He truly believed that he could help create something very, very special in Spain. And so you have these spheres of influence that emerged throughout the medieval period, some based at Damascus, others based in Baghdad, and then you have this center of civilization and cultural influence based in Córdoba on European soil. Now, Maria Rosa Menocal, who unfortunately passed away just a few months ago, was sort of the dean of historians of medieval Iberia. She wrote a number of very important books, the first one emerging in 1987, called The Arabic Role in Medieval Literary History. The Arabic Role in Medieval Literary History. You would think, she says in the opening pages of the book, you would think that if you lived somewhere for almost 9 centuries, you would get the right to be called a local. And I'm paraphrasing her a little bit. Yet, when the canon of European literature was set down in the late 1800s and early 20th century, Arab literature, the Arab literary and artistic productions of medieval Iberia didn't quite make the cut. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why? Why is that so? How could they have been left out? How could they have been edited out? Well, in part probably because of racialized theory. The Arabs and the Spaniards, by extension, just weren't quite white enough to make the cut as Europeans, as Western Europeans. There are other reasons for this, some of which I will explore in tomorrow morning's lecture. Early modern Spain had a great deal to do with it. You know, Spain, as I tell my students, created cultural suicide in 1492 by deciding to expel its best and brightest. Not a very smart thing to do if you really want to build up the national storehouse of intellectual and cultural treasure. But Spain had also been fighting a 750-year religious war from its perspective, which brings us back to 711 for a few moments. So imagine from the year 711 to the year 1492, those people whom we would later call Spaniards waged a cosmic and messianic struggle to regain their lands from these Arab, Berber, Moorish, Muslim, etc., invaders. which they clothed in the aura of a religious war, as well as a territorial battle. In Spanish history, it's called La Reconquista, the reconquest. And just so that we're not too quick to judge, I wonder what we would be like ourselves had we emerged from a 750-year military conflict. And I'm not talking 750 years of constant warfare, but I am talking of 750 years of intermittent warfare, to the point where the soldier, the warrior, the military man, and military technology were some of the most valued types of work and socio-political roles in Spain for centuries. And yet on the other side of that divide, you still had Islamic kingdoms, such as the state of Córdoba, that thrived for centuries. Later on, the center of power on the Muslim side, on the medieval Islamic Iberian side, would shift to Sevilla, to Seville. And still later, it would shift back to Córdoba, and still later it would shift to Granada. So these are the different types of centers of power that you see ebb and flow throughout that multi-year history. I mean, that really is an enormously long span of time. Think of how old the United States is. And picture for a moment how the period from 711 to 1492 dwarfs the length of time in which the United States of America has existed. And I only say that because I want to impress upon you that we're talking about centuries and centuries of cultural, theological, philosophical, scientific production that eventually would indeed become the envy of the world. So now why don't we know more about this? Well, again, you know, the victors usually are the ones who write history. And unfortunately, 1492 is also regarded in Spanish history as el año milagroso, the miraculous year, because it was on January 2nd of 1492 that Spain, under the rulership of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, finally defeated the last Islamic kingdom on European soil. Now, I'm not sure that I would have wanted to be in their shoes, because what do you do when all that you know is othering? You know what I mean by that, excluding, okay? If you're really good at excluding others and demonizing a certain group within society, or more than one group in society, and one morning you wake up and you find yourselves the masters of the most religiously diverse and racially diverse country in Europe, and you don't have too many resources to sort of honor that treasure, maybe even expand it, nurture it, take care of it, what are you going to do? You see? And it was really an amazing opportunity, an amazing moment in the history of Europe. Now, I know we don't think that medieval Europeans were very creative about diversity and inclusivity, but I'm going to share with you a few examples in a few moments to try and counter that stereotype. Unfortunately, that was the year that Spain also decided finally to try and rid itself of its Jewish problem. In the spring of 1492, a group of clergy who would not let go of the issue finally came to Ferdinand and Isabel again and said, basically they presented a case for expulsion. And an order of expulsion was signed by the monarchy that spring, giving the Jewish citizens of Spain, which by the way was now a unified Spain under the rulership of Ferdinand and Isabel, giving them 90 days to either convert to Roman Catholicism, leave Spain, or face the Inquisition. The trouble with that is not only that by our standards it's just plain wrong, the Jewish citizens of Spain were also its doctors, its lawyers, its mathematicians, its accountants. They were the tax collectors for the monarchy. We could dwell on that a little bit, and we will tomorrow. Because imagine every time the king raised taxes, if the people coming to collect the taxes were his Jewish accountants, you can imagine what that set up by way of anti-Semitic sentiments eventually. But anyway, as the story goes, many chose to leave for Egypt or North Africa, or also for Turkey. Many chose to stay, however, because they could not bear to leave their beloved Sepharad. These were the Sephardic Jews. They could not bear to tear themselves away from the land, from the homes, from the places that they had called home for centuries upon centuries. And they decided eventually, oh wait, one other thing that year. Ferdinand of Aragon had tried very hard to secure the papal throne and to make sure that someone ascended the papal throne who would be incredibly loyal and incredibly supportive of Spain. And sure enough, the Pope, Alexander VI, also known as Cesare Borgia, told Ferdinand of Aragon that the Spanish Inquisition could report directly to the monarchy and not to the Archbishop of Toledo. Probably one of the great mistakes of the early modern period, or of the late Middle Ages, depending how you want to read those periods. The effect was that the Inquisition in Spain became an instrument of national identity. And so the Spaniards in the early 1500s wanted to forge a national identity out of all of that diversity and ambiguity that they had inherited, rather than live with the ambiguity, which is what had happened on Iberian soil for centuries. And one of the things was to smoke out the Jews, literally. And so the inquisitors often came to the home at dinner time to check on, what are you cooking? Don't you eat pork? We Spaniards love pork. What is this? You're sitting on the floor on pillows? Almohada is the Arabic word for pillow. And it was an Arabic custom to sit on these very nicely embroidered pillows rather than on chairs. And so the Spanish Inquisition was one of the big reasons and one of the major problems by which we eventually knew less and less and less about this period that I and some of my colleagues have tried so very hard to reconstruct. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, Spanish bishops bragged about the number of Arabic manuscripts that they had ordered to be burned. This is deeply disturbing, but it was part of the culture of the time. The Archbishop of Toledo, actually, we have an exchange of him with an archbishop from another city in which he is literally bragging about the X number of manuscripts that I ordered to be burned, and you, my dear colleague, are falling behind because I don't hear that you've burned quite as many as I have. Just 200 years earlier, I have evidence in my research files at home of a French clergyman in the south of France lamenting from the pulpit that the young men in his diocese have forgotten their ecclesiastical Latin. Obviously, this is an upper class audience that he's preaching to. He's lamenting that they have forgotten their ecclesiastical Latin, but they can write the most beautiful poetry in Arabic to their sweethearts. An amazing transformation in just about a 250-year period. We also have evidence that the religious buildings in Spain were shared by the three Abrahamic faiths. Imagine that. Imagine how that might change our own practices, our own perceptions of each other. This occurred out of necessity, because in the early period, in the early Middle Ages, extra and lavish cathedrals and religious centers were in short supply. So imagine a cathedral, a church, a sacred structure that was used on Fridays by Muslims, on Saturdays by Jews, and on Sundays by Christians. And then imagine that that went on for nearly 300 years in Iberia, in the Islamic territories, not in the Christian territories. However, when the Reconquista began gaining ground and more Islamic territories were falling to Christian princes and warriors, these Christian princes and warriors actually tried to honor the diversity of the cultures that they were now in charge of. And monuments, for example, Alfonso VI of Leon Castile, actually had monuments inscribed in multiple languages in order to appeal to the populace, to the people. One of the most important turning points in the long history of the Reconquest is the fall of Toledo in the year 1085 to the Christian forces of Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile. Because Alfonso, being a very progressive ruler for the time, immediately decided to set up a translation center in Toledo. A translation center that specialized in translating Arabic manuscripts into Latin. Because Alfonso had realized that many of the copies of Aristotle and of Plato that were in use among Christian philosophers and theologians were less accurate than the copies of these same Greco-Roman classics that Arab scholars were working with in their native tongue of Arabic. And so Toledo becomes this, we can't quite call it a publishing center, because there is no such thing literally as publishing, but it becomes a major center of translation where manuscripts and folio volumes are being copied in a remarkable collaborative effort and then sent off to the University of Paris, to the University of Bologna, to the University of Naples, and eventually, many years later, Cambridge and Oxford, etc., etc., etc. So the point that I'm getting at is one that you probably already know and you've already heard, and that is that the Italian Renaissance, the Renaissance that Europe would claim as this very unique phenomenon of its own, owes a huge debt to the translation work that was carried out in Iberia from 1085 to about the early 1400s. And the system that was in place was really quite fascinating. You literally had an Arab, a specialist in the Arab language working alongside a specialist sometimes in Greek or a specialist in Latin. And I would love to have been a fly on the wall, so to speak, just to see what kind of dialogue emerged among them when they took their break, for example, or even in the process of working on these manuscripts. Did they see that despite their vast cultural and theological differences, that they had something in common in the realm of the spirit, in the realm of theology? We know that they did from other traces that have come down to us from that time. There is a medieval dialogue tradition called dialogues of mutual edification. There were plenty of dialogues of exclusion, and those are the ones I'm sure you've heard a lot about. You know, Muslims are heathens. Muslims will not be saved because they deny the divinity of Christ. Muslims will not be saved because they deny the Trinity. They believe that God is one, etc., 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 etc. Muslims probably ask, gee, why do you Christians worship three gods instead of one? That sounds pretty messed up to me as a Muslim. Okay, I'm speaking in character. I'm not Muslim. But anyway, you get the picture and the general gist of where I'm going with that. Okay? So these dialogues of mutual edification are one of the ways that I think we need to revisit the legacies and the lessons of that era. Bear in mind, it was an era of great prosperity on the Islamic political side of this divide. Remember, there are Christian kingdoms and there are Muslim kingdoms. And on the Muslim side, there's great prosperity. On the Christian side, Europe is slowly coming out of the period we call the Dark Ages. It takes a long time for Europe to come out of that. It takes a long time for Europe to get back to a thriving economy. Feudalism did not help. Okay, feudalism, the political system of the medieval world, based on German tribal traditions, it involved the exchange of land for protection. The person giving the land was usually referred to as the lord. The person receiving the land in the feudal contract was usually referred to as the vassal. It made for great political instability because there was a great deal of war and conflict, and there was the Christian church, the Latin church of Western Europe, trying to mediate feudal warfare as best it could, okay? Which eventually gave the church also great power and great influence. But so imagine these dialogues of mutual edification. I told you that Muhammad referred to the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims as the al-Kitab, literally the people of the book. Well, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 tell us whether we are reading it as a Jew or reading it as a Christian. Those two verses tell us that we are created in the image and likeness of the divine. That is a profound statement. One that our medieval forebears and our early Christian forebears did not take as some sort of symbolic implication. Rather, they took it to say that human beings had a very special place in the created order. Many of our most cherished notions about human dignity and justice and peace come from that particular verse in the Jewish tradition, which Christianity then, of course, inherited by virtue of its own relationship to Judaism. And in the Holy Quran, in Surah number 2, verses 30 through 38, we read again that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And so throughout those long centuries of reconquest, those long centuries of convivencia or coexistence, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars often came together and asked each other, what does it mean, my brother? What does it mean, my sister, that we are created in the image and likeness of God? And that all three of our traditions believe this. You can see where you can go with that. Because that which diminishes my fellow man or woman in society, my fellow citizen, my brother or my sister, also diminishes me. Because God wants flourishing. God wants eudaimonia, as we say in Greek, or beatitudo, as we say in Latin. God made us to be all that we were intended to be, despite the sufferings of human life and sin and evil in the world. And so these are some of the ways in which the phenomenon of coexistence ends up leading to some very interesting developments in the theological and cultural and philosophical arenas. But that's just one example. Let me share with you a couple others. Back to Ibn Arabi. I tell my students that we historians do our best work when we're storytellers. So if you will please indulge me, I'm going to share two stories with you from the period. The first is from Ibn al-Arabi. He offers us an exegesis, if you will, of Surah 31, verse 27 from the Holy Quran. That verse is about the trees of the earth and the seven seas. It's also a verse very much about the names of God. And Ibn Arabi, after reflecting on why are there so many different religious traditions, why does God seem to delight in diversity and multiplicity, meditated on this verse and said that if all of the trees in the world were pens and the seven seas ink, Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine that. There's a lot of trees on planet Earth. And there's a lot of water in those 7 seas. And if together they began writing the names of God, Ibn Arabi says they could not possibly exhaust the names by which God had made the divine self known to the children of God across time and place. And that for Ibn Arabi, while he was still living in Spain, was the basis for an Islamic theory of religious toleration. That particular verse. Now we Christians can call upon all sorts of things too, can't we? The commandment to love one another, the commandment to do charitable works for our fellow human beings, the commandment to love the Lord our God with all thy heart, and the commandment to follow Christ and make disciples of all nations. But Christianity also has some exclusivist perceptions about, Christ's statement that he is the light and the way. And we can talk about that. We can come back to that in a few moments. But so imagine Ibn Arabi making this particular statement based upon, again, an exegesis and exegeting a particular verse in the Holy Quran. That's one example. I could actually give you many more. That just happens to be one. At the height of the Crusades, surrounded by war and conflict, and very much aware of the fragility of human life. 1165 to 1240. The other story that I'm going to share with you is a very Christian story. It's one that you've probably heard about before, but not in quite the way I'm about to share it with you. I'm mindful here of the time. There is a legend written around the year 1200 by a German poet knight called Wolfram von Aschenbach. Wolfram von Aschenbach, we are quite certain, went on crusade. I actually believe he went on crusade in the south of Europe, possibly even having first-hand knowledge of Seville or of Granada or of one of the cities in that region. He wrote a poem called Parzival. This is a story about the Holy Grail. But in this particular story, the Grail is not a chalice. You know, in most of the legends of King Arthur and the Holy Grail, the Grail is the chalice of the Last Supper. And King Arthur's knights go out in search of the Grail. In this story, in Wolfram von Aschenbach's version, the Grail is a sacred stone that fell from heaven on Good Friday, many, many years ago. And it's an oracular stone. On the sides of the stone, Wolfram tells us the will of God appears. Now, the interesting thing about this story is that it became one of the favorite stories in Germany in the 1800s and early 1900s. In fact, it was Hitler's favorite story, but sterilized, because German scholars for over 100 years, disturbed in their own words by the Semitic elements in the story, tried to sterilize, forgive me, I mean no disrespect, in their own words, those dirty Semitic origins of the story. The story is filled with Jewish and Muslim characters, filled with them. And Wolfram himself tells us repeatedly, I didn't write this story. I got it from so-and-so who got it from so-and-so who got it from so-and-so. And the so-and-sos, I gotta tell you, lead us all the way back to Toledo, to medieval Toledo. So this is a story of the Holy Grail, a sacred stone, in this case, that fell from heaven on Good Friday, a stone that seems to be somewhere perched between the Christian imagination and the Islamic imagination, because meteorites and sacred stones are very special in Islamic lore and in Arabic lore. And so we come to the other point, the very human part of the story. there are two young men, Percival, which means innocent fool, but can also mean pierced through the middle, and Phereiphes. Percival is the champion of the West, meaning he is the most successful, the most powerful, the most feared knight in joust and in battle. And his father was Gamuret, and his mother was Herzeloida, a French Angevin queen. And Gamuret apparently is also related to the House of Anjou in France. The champion from the east is Phereiphes. And Phereiphes was the son of Belacana, an Arab queen, and of a Christian knight, whose name we don't completely know throughout part of the story. Anyway, as so often happens by the grace of God, events conspire to bring these two young men, after many, many years of skirmishes and, sort of missing each other, events conspire to bring them to a joust on the Saturday of Pentecost weekend. Yep, it's Pentecost. I should also tell you that the story itself spans 7 Pentecosts. So the author spreads it out over a 7-year period. Literally, all of the major action and turning points and transformations occur around Pentecost week or weekend over a 7-year period. This is the 7th Pentecost of a 7-year journey of transformation. And these two young men face each other. And here on one side you have the Grail family, okay, King Arthur and Guinevere and you name it. And on the other side you have other royalty from the medieval period, some of them historic, some of them mythic. And there are these two young men in the middle of this field flanked by 2 hills. And they dismount rather than charge at each other with lances. And they engage each other in sword fight. And then a very amazing thing happens. Percival's sword breaks miraculously. And he's sort of standing there looking at the sword like, oh, what do I do now? And the Arab knight, whom we are told all throughout the story is black and white, pied like the magpie. In our language it would be that he is of mixed racial origins. He takes a step back, he puts his sword down and he says, you look familiar to me. Who was your father? And Percival, probably relieved that he's not about to get his head chopped off, says, my father was Gamuret, but he left my mother because he had wanderlust for knight errantry and for battle. I was still a babe. I heard many years later that he died in the service of the Caliph of Baghdad. And Phereiphes says, Gamuret, how could this be? Praise Allah. Gamuret was my father. And he too left my mother Belacana in the middle of the night when I was but a babe, because he thirsted for the thrill of battle. And so these two young men, in a very untypically medieval story, approach each other, embrace, give each other a kiss. And what are we, the audience, to assume? That we are witnessing perhaps an allegory of reconciliation among the children of Abraham. And this from the medieval imagination, mind you, at the very height of the European Crusades. The next day is Pentecost Sunday. A rider comes forth from the so-called Grail Castle, known as Mont Salvage, which means Mount of Salvation, but could also mean Wild Mountain. And the rider is a woman, by the way, again, very uncharacteristic of these medieval stories. And the woman proclaims that the will of God has announced itself on the Grail Stone, calling Phereiphes and Percival to the fellowship of the Holy Grail. And that they are to take their rightful place alongside the Grail King, etc., 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 etc. So there you have a couple of examples that we have time for within the bounds of this evening's lecture, to get at the medieval religious imagination's propensity, if you will, or predisposition to engage in dialogues of mutual edification, or if not in dialogues, and at least in an imagination of mutual edification from the very diversity and the very violence and the very challenges that they had experienced and perceived in the world in which they lived. And what I often leave audiences with is a reflection. If that kind of imagination was possible for medieval men and women, and there are other examples I could give you, I've only chosen 2 of them for the sake of time, then what kind of imagination and thinking outside of the box, creative bread breaking together, might we be capable of, given the incredible access to knowledge and resources that we have in our time, in our moment in history? Henry Nouwen, in The Wounded Healer, says that a Christian community is a healing community, not because wounds and pains become occasions for healing, which of course they are, but because wounds and pains become openings or occasions for a new vision, a new way of being in relationship with others, and a new way of being in community with each other. I'm asked all the time what I believe are the parallels between medieval Liberia and our time. And we need to be really, really careful about that, because we are not medieval men and women. We are not medieval Spaniards. We are not medieval Iberian Muslims. We are not medieval Jews. But we do live in a time in which the diversity and the multiplicity, the diversity of our society and the multiplicity of faiths represented in our society are growing significantly and expanding. I can tell you my experience from living and working in a community in New Jersey in the 1990s that was one of the most religiously and racially diverse communities in North America, where the Muslim population had reached such an extent, such a percentage, that the public schools actually gave 2 days off for Ramadan. A community where, unfortunately, some of the tickets that the terrorists who flew the planes on 9/11 purchased at a travel agency in the community, got to put in those negative elements as well. I can honestly tell you that I experienced a community of that level of diversity where Christians and Muslims, clergy as well as laity, were working very effectively in the social arena to advance each other's needs and interests, particularly in how to improve the public schools of Paterson, New Jersey, which were in such a terrible state of administrative incompetence in the late 1990s that the state of New Jersey ended up taking over the school system and running it for a few months, maybe even a couple of years. My memory's a little fuzzy. And there you have an example of one of the ways in which you can actually cross the divide. I got to be honest with you. Sitting down to talk about your religious differences may be one of the worst things you could possibly do. Not that we don't benefit from understanding our different perceptions of Scripture, our different religious practices, our different religious traditions, but in some parts of the United States, in some parts of the world, the potential from mutual cooperation that is mutually edifying is so great that I believe we are constantly this close to doing something that will turn things around dramatically in terms of interreligious dialogue and interreligious cooperation. But for whatever reasons, we don't cross the divide sometimes. We don't reach our hand out across the aisle. We don't invite the other to break bread with us. Or, we retreat into our own silos for whatever reasons. It's human nature. So there's just one example of a place where I lived that I thought exhibited some of the very best ideals of that legacy of medieval Iberian convivencia. When remember, convivencia simply means coexistence. And coexistence is about collaboration. But please don't think that it's collaboration without tension. One of the things that I think made medieval Iberia thrive was precisely the fact that the tensions that existed could actually be harnessed in a creative and edifying way. Anyway, that is the gist of my presentation for this evening. I hope those two stories that I shared with you and those reflections on Judeo-Christian scriptures and the Holy Quran will give you food for thought and spiritual nurture as well. Thank you very much.